On Christmas Day, I dressed the house exactly the way my wife had always loved. Golden lights traced the porch, and the tree glimmered with our old ornaments. I prepared the best meal I knew how to make: rosemary roast beef, garlic mashed potatoes, and a pecan pie cooling on the windowsill. It was my first Christmas without Miriam, who had passed away 5 months earlier. The only wish I had was to sit at the table with my son and his wife. I set the china in place, lit the candles, and waited. But instead of hearing their car pulling into the driveway, I saw a courier climb the porch steps with an envelope in hand. Inside was a note that made one thing impossible to ignore. They hadn't forgotten me. They had simply chosen to be somewhere else. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The messenger looked no older than 20. A red windbreaker hung from his shoulders, thin gloves covering his hands, his expression impatient, like someone with 20 more deliveries before heading home. He asked if this was a delivery for Arthur Harrington, his gaze sliding past me toward the warmth of the house. I answered quietly, and he handed me the envelope before nodding once and heading back down the steps. The crunch of his shoes on the frosted path echoed in the silence until the weak cough of his engine carried him away. The envelope felt warm from his touch, but its weight was thin. Even before breaking the seal, I already knew it would not hold good news. My hand paused on the flap for a moment. I glanced at the golden lights wrapped around the railing, casting their soft glow on the snow-dusted steps, and thought of how Miriam would have been standing behind me, curious. She always wanted to know who came to the door. Finally, I tore the envelope open. In neat, looping handwriting, Tessa had written, "Arthur, we decided to spend Christmas at my mother's this year. Hope you understand. Love, Tessa." That was all. No wish for a Merry Christmas. No suggestion of making plans later. Not even a phone call before sending the message by stranger. Understand? The word clung to me. I stepped back inside, shutting the cold out, and from the hallway I could see the dining room glowing beneath the chandelier. The roast beef rested on its platter, still steaming with herbs. The mashed potatoes, smooth and creamy, held a small parsley sprig Miriam would have approved of. The pecan pie on the counter gleamed under the kitchen light, its crust browned and delicate. I had poured hours into it all, marinating the beef 2 days earlier, baking the pie the night before, and pressing the holiday tablecloth until it was crisp. The china had been laid, the silver polished, the napkins folded into fans just the way Miriam used to do them. The candles flickered softly, their glow dancing across the crystal glasses. It was the kind of Christmas she would have adored. But now the room belonged only to me. I poured a glass of sweet tea and sat at the head of the table. The roast beef was tender and perfectly seasoned, but it might as well have been tasteless. My throat tightened as I chewed, and I washed it down with tea. After only a few bites, I put my fork aside. The food had no flavor. I blew out the candles one by one and packed the meal into containers. Only the pie remained on the counter. Something in me couldn't put it away. Perhaps it was Miriam's old habit of leaving dessert out in case someone stopped by. But I knew nobody was coming. I picked up my phone more to pass the time than to expect a message. Their decision had already been made. Still, I scrolled. That was when I saw a post from Tessa's mother on Facebook. A long dining table covered with food, wine glasses catching the light, people leaning close with faces bright from laughter. At the far end sat my son beside his wife, his hand resting on hers, a smile on his face I hadn't seen in years. The caption read, "So grateful for a house full of family this Christmas." Grateful. The word lodged in my chest like a stone. They were grateful for that table, but not for mine. I stared until the screen dimmed, my reflection faint in the glass. My mind wandered back to the mornings when Nathan was small. He would wake us at dawn, running down the hallway in his pajamas, while the smell of cinnamon rolls filled the air. Miriam stood in the kitchen, pulling them from the oven as powdered sugar drifted over the tops. On Christmas Eve, I would read The Night Before Christmas by the fire, his head resting against my shoulder. For years, this house was the center of the holiday. After his marriage, I tried to alternate the holidays, 1 year here, 1 year there. But little by little, 1 year turned into, we might stop by if we have the time. I told myself it was simply how life went, couples dividing holidays and schedules. But this, sending a courier on Christmas Day, was not about busyness. It was a message. I set the phone face down on the table and leaned back in my chair. The house was unbearably quiet. From the living room, the steady tick of the clock marked each second, carrying me further from the life I once had. The fire cracked faintly in the hearth, but the sound felt empty. My eyes rested on the Christmas tree in the corner, its lights flickering in silence. The gold star at the top of the tree was the one my son had crafted back in 3rd grade. One of its points had broken long ago, yet Miriam always insisted it belonged in the center. She would smile and say it was perfect just the way it was. I wondered what she might have said about this Christmas. Perhaps she would have told me not to dwell on it, to enjoy the meal, and not take things so personally. But Miriam knew me too well. She would have understood it was never just about the food. It was about what it all represented. After a while, I moved to the living room and lowered myself into the recliner. It groaned under my weight, the same chair I had sat in on every Christmas night for more than 40 years. Across from me, Miriam's chair stood empty. Her knitting basket still sat beside it, a ball of yarn unraveled halfway. I had never found the heart to move it. Outside, a car rolled slowly down the wet road, its headlights brushing across the wall. For a brief second, my instinct was to think it might be them, turning around, but the sound passed by and faded. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, hands clasped tight. I tried telling myself it was only one holiday. Yet deep inside, I knew the truth. This wasn't a one-time thing. It had been building for years, and Miriam would have been the first to tell me so. On the counter, the note from Tessa still lay where I had left it. I picked it up again. Her handwriting, smooth, careful loops, looked almost cheerful against the stark white paper. I pictured the two of them as it was written. Had my son even seen it before it was sent? Or had Tessa handled it all herself, sparing him the discomfort of saying what he didn't want to say? By then, the roast beef had cooled. I slid the containers into the fridge, the burst of cold air meeting my face. The pie still rested untouched on the counter. I couldn't bring myself to cover it. By the time the clock struck 9, I had given up the pretense of watching television. I turned off the strings of lights on the tree one by one and headed down the hallway toward my room. On the dresser sat a framed photo of our last Christmas with Miriam. My son and his wife had joined us that year, though they had arrived late, already full from eating elsewhere. In the picture, Miriam's smile glowed with warmth, while my son looked simply polite. I sat on the bed's edge, staring at the photo until my vision blurred. When I finally lay down, the space beside me was cold, and for the first time I admitted the truth. It wasn't that they had forgotten me. They had chosen someone else's table. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, though I had hardly slept at all. My eyes had been fixed on the ceiling through most of the night, watching the shadows of tree branches sway across the wall. When I walked into the living room, I noticed the tree lights still glowed. I must have forgotten to turn them off before bed. They cast a gentle shine over the furniture, but instead of warmth, the house looked frozen, like a photograph, beautiful, yet lifeless. I didn't make coffee right away. My thoughts felt too unsettled to stand still in the kitchen. Pulling on my sweater, I stepped outside. The air bit at my cheeks, sharp and cold, the kind of cold that stung when you inhaled too deeply. Frost still clung to the yard, blades of grass edged in white, the birdbath frozen over. Miriam had always started her mornings out there, no matter the weather. She would follow the little stone path to the garden and check the bird feeder that hung from the maple tree near the edge of the yard. I had never understood why she cared about feeding birds in the dead of winter. She would simply smile and say they still needed food, even when no one else was watching. Without thinking, I followed the same path, my hands tucked deep into my sweater pockets. The wooden feeder swayed lightly in the breeze, empty. It was shaped like a small house with a slanted roof, Miriam's choice, of course. She had said it made the birds feel welcome. I don't know why I reached up to touch it. Habit, maybe. But when my fingers brushed the frame, I felt something wedged under the roof. An envelope. It was tucked in so securely I nearly missed it. The paper edges were slightly weathered, but the flap remained sealed. On the front, my name was written just Arthur. Not Arthur Harrington. Not Mr. Harrington. Simply Arthur, the way Miriam had always written on birthday cards or little notes for the fridge. Seeing her handwriting froze me in place. I ran my thumb over the letters as if I could feel her through them. In the corner was a date almost 6 months earlier, just 1 week before she passed. My breath caught. I glanced around the yard, half expecting someone to appear and tell me what to do. But it was only me, the frost, and the silence. I carried the envelope back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at it for what felt like a full minute before opening it. The paper was folded neatly, a single page. There was no greeting, no holiday message. Just words in Miriam's unmistakable script. If you are reading this, something has happened that I hoped wouldn't. Go to my desk, the top drawer. There is more. That was it. No signature, no explanation. The chair scraped across the floor as I pushed back and walked down the hall toward the study. Her desk had sat untouched since she died. Her pen cup still held its contents. Her reading glasses rested atop crossword books, and a small ceramic dish brimmed with paper clips. I knelt and opened the top drawer. At first, there were only ordinary things, stationery, notepads, a half-used pack of stamps. But as my hand brushed the bottom, I felt something taped beneath. Another envelope, thicker this time. Carefully, I peeled it free. A small brass key was clipped to the outside. Inside was the key, a folded document, and another note in Miriam's hand. Arthur, if our son ever shuts you out, this will make sense. You will find everything you need at the place this key opens. It is yours. It always was. You just never knew. My knees bent under me as I read. The paper trembled in my hands. She had known. She had seen all of this coming. The document was a deed, official and stamped, with my name printed in bold. The address belonged to a place I did not recognize, a small town about 40 minutes away. Hendersonville. I stared at the name. We had never owned property there. Miriam had never once mentioned it in all our years together. Why would she keep such a place from me? And why tie it to the possibility of being shut out by my own son? I turned the brass key over in my hand. It was cool, its edges smooth from use, the surface polished but worn. I thought briefly about calling my neighbor and longtime friend, Frank, but the idea of trying to explain all of this over the phone felt wrong. This was something I needed to face on my own. I set the envelope and key down on Miriam's desk, then went to the bedroom and pulled out my overnight bag. I packed a change of clothes, a flashlight, my wallet, and the old thermos Miriam always insisted I take whenever I had a long drive ahead. In the kitchen, I made a quick sandwich, filled the thermos with fresh coffee, and glanced at the clock. It was just after 9. The winter sun already low, but the roads clear enough. As I zipped the bag shut, my eyes fell on the chair in the corner. Draped over its back was Miriam's old blue cardigan. She used to wear it in bed while reading, sleeves pushed up, glasses perched on her nose. I reached out and smoothed the fabric gently. "You really thought ahead, didn't you?" I said into the empty room. The drive out of town was quiet. I passed the frozen lake, the hardware store Miriam loved to drag me to on Saturdays, and mile after mile of bare trees rising like ancient sentinels along the road. Hendersonville appeared sooner than I expected. Just a cluster of small shops, a diner, and a gas station that looked unchanged for decades. The address led me down a gravel road hidden behind a row of tall pines. I slowed to read the numbers posted on the mailboxes until one matched the deed. Before me stood a modest white house with blue shutters and a stone porch. It wasn't run down, but it wasn't meant to impress either. It looked settled, as if it had been waiting all along. I parked in the driveway. The steps creaked under my boots as I climbed them, the key warm in my pocket. It slid into the lock as though it belonged there. When the door clicked open, I hesitated. It felt almost as if I were stepping into a space Miriam had just walked out of. Inside, the air was faintly scented with cedar and something sweet, maybe from the polished furniture. Everything was neat and cared for, like someone had been keeping it ready. In the living room, a wooden mantel displayed framed photographs. One of Miriam and me on our 35th anniversary, another of her on the beach with sandals in her hand, her hair wild in the wind. And then there was one I had never seen before. Miriam sitting on this very porch, a coffee cup in hand, smiling at someone just out of view. The couch was the same style as the one in our first home. The bookshelf held titles I knew, arranged exactly the way Miriam always did. Mysteries up top, cookbooks down below. On the coffee table sat a folded note beside a set of coasters. I picked it up. This is yours in case they ever forget who you are. No date, no signature, nothing else. I sank slowly into the chair, the note trembling in my hand. She hadn't just meant the house. She was reminding me of my worth, my place in this family, and she had built something to ensure I would never forget it. I walked into the kitchen. The cabinets were lined with neatly stacked dishes. The pantry stocked with non-perishable staples: rice, pasta, canned vegetables. The refrigerator was unplugged but spotless. On the inside of a cabinet door hung a grocery list written in Miriam's handwriting. Coffee, bread, eggs, sugar. 2 chairs sat at the kitchen table. One had a cushion Miriam had sewn herself. I touched it lightly, half expecting it to still carry her warmth. Down the hall, 2 bedrooms waited. One had a neatly made bed with a folded quilt at the foot. The other stood mostly empty, save for a few boxes stacked in the corner labeled Arthur's things. I didn't open them, not yet. Back in the living room, I lowered myself into the armchair by the window and gazed out at the yard. A birdhouse stood at the back, and a bench rested beside what would become a flower bed in the spring. The quiet here wasn't heavy like at home. It was peaceful, intentional. I thought again about the note from Tessa and the Facebook post from yesterday. From here, those things seemed smaller, as if they belonged to another world. Miriam had understood. She had seen the visits grow shorter, the way Tessa spoke in my son's place more often than he spoke himself. Instead of confronting it directly, Miriam had built a safeguard. She had left me a place that was mine alone, something no one could take or claim without my say. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the light move across the window. At last, I stood, locked the door behind me, and drove back toward town. The key in my pocket felt warm against my hand. I didn't have every answer yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay ahead, I was not as alone as I had believed. The following morning, I couldn't shake the thought of the cabin. I woke with my mind on the note resting on the coffee table, on Miriam's handwriting inside the cabinet door. It felt like she had set a place for me there without ever saying a word. I had driven home the night before, but my bag remained unpacked. The key sat on the nightstand, catching the pale morning light. I picked it up, turning the smooth brass in my hand. Miriam's second note echoed in my mind. If Nathan ever shuts you out. What exactly had she seen coming? And what else had she prepared that I still didn't know? I made coffee and stood by the window, watching frost retreat from the edges of the lawn. My eyes drifted to the house next door. In the driveway sat Frank Ivany's old Ford pickup. Frank, my friend, a retired lawyer who never missed the Sunday crossword and could recite baseball stats from 3 decades ago. If anyone could help me understand legal papers or explain the meaning of a hidden deed, it was him. I took a long sip of coffee, set the mug down, and picked up the envelope with the deed from Miriam's desk. Frank answered his door in a flannel shirt, holding a half-eaten slice of toast. "Arthur," he said, eyebrows raised, "you're up early. Everything all right?" "Not exactly," I replied quietly. "Got a minute?" He stepped aside and motioned me in. His house smelled faintly of wood smoke and buttered toast. We sat at his kitchen table, the morning paper folded neatly in front of him. "What's on your mind?" Frank asked. I placed the envelope on the table and slid it across. He pulled out the deed, adjusted his glasses, and read in silence for a while. When he finally looked up, his eyes were sharper than I'd seen in years. "Hendersonville," he said slowly. "That's a nice little spot out that way. And this," he tapped the page, "is in your name alone. No co-owner. Did you know about it before?" I shook my head. Never even heard of it until yesterday. Frank set the paper down firmly. Then this wasn't chance. Your wife made sure it was separate. Which means, legally speaking, no one but you has a claim. I leaned back, uneasy. But why would she do that? Frank gave me a long, steady look. Why do you think? I didn't answer right away. In my mind, I saw again the image of my son and Tessa at that other table on Christmas Day. The note, the Facebook post. Frank went on. Arthur, people don't hide assets unless they're protecting them. From taxes, creditors, or family disputes. I frowned. Family disputes. He folded his hands together. You want me to be blunt? Please. I've seen cases where grown children or their spouses start pressing for control of property after one parent is gone. Sometimes it's concern. Sometimes it's not. I stared at the deed, the truth settling heavier with every second. Miriam had thought farther ahead than I ever realized. There's more, I murmured, pulling the smaller note from the envelope and sliding it across. Frank read it carefully, then leaned back. She was giving you choices. This cabin is yours, no conditions. If, God forbid, things with Nathan got complicated, you'd have somewhere to go. Somewhere they can't touch. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. She saw it coming. Miriam was sharp, Frank said quietly. She probably noticed things you didn't want to see. I thought back to the way Tessa often spoke for Nathan. How she had offered to handle my mail when I was recovering from surgery. How she had suggested managing the bills when Miriam was in the hospital. All politely declined at the time, but clearer now. Frank sipped his coffee. You should dig further. If she went through the trouble of moving property into your name, she may have set up more protections. I nodded. I'll check her files. You need help? I'm around, he said. And Arthur, don't wait too long. If they're the type to make a move, they won't waste time. I left his place carrying a strange mix of gratitude and unease. Grateful for Miriam's foresight, unsettled at what it suggested about my son. Back at home, I went straight to Miriam's study. I opened every drawer, searched behind books, flipped through her address book. Nothing obvious appeared. No more envelopes, no hidden keys. But at the bottom of one drawer, beneath a pile of old magazines, I found a folder labeled in her handwriting. Household Private. Inside were tax returns, insurance statements, and a list titled Accounts, Arthur. Several were in my name alone. Some had only been opened in recent years. One entry caught my attention. Radcliffe and Associates. Trust 2941. Beside it was a note in parentheses. Ask Frank if needed. I picked up the phone. Frank, ever heard of Radcliffe and Associates? There was a pause. Then, yeah, Miles Radcliffe, old school accountant, worked with a lot of my clients. Why? His name's in one of Miriam's folders. Something about a trust. Frank gave a low whistle. Now that's something. He's still in business downtown. Want me to set up a meeting? I agreed, and Frank promised to call back with details. While I waited, I drove out to the cabin again. This time I opened the boxes marked Arthur's things. Inside were photo albums, some of Miriam's favorite cookbooks, and a small lockbox without a key in sight. I set it aside for later. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee with the old drip machine that looked like the one from our first apartment. Sitting at the table, the grocery list still taped inside the cabinet door, I felt how deliberate all of this was. Miriam hadn't just prepared a backup. She had created a refuge. Back home again, Frank called around 3. Radcliffe can see you tomorrow morning, he said. I told him you've got paperwork Miriam left behind. He sounded like he already knew. That night, lying in bed, I turned it all over in my mind. A hidden cabin, a private trust. Miriam's warnings came back in her calm, certain voice. If you ever feel like they're pushing you out, you'll know where to go. I hadn't understood then. Now I did. By morning, I was ready. I dressed in my best jacket, not to impress Radcliffe, but to walk in as a man still in control of his own life. The office was in a modest brick building above a bakery. The smell of fresh bread followed me up the stairwell. Inside, The reception area was simple. 2 chairs, a desk, and filing cabinets. Miles Radcliffe himself stepped out to greet me. He was in his late 60s, trim, sharp-eyed behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Harrington," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "Come on back." His office was lined with shelves full of binders marked by year. We sat at a small table by the window. "I understand Miriam left you some documents," he began. I handed him the folder. He leafed through, nodding at certain pages. "Yes, just as I thought," he said finally. "About 5 years ago, your wife established a private trust in your name, separate from joint accounts. Clear terms, only you have control. No successor trustee, no one else attached." I blinked. Why wouldn't she tell me? A faint smile touched his lips. "She said she didn't want you to feel you needed it, that it was simply a just-in-case measure." I leaned back, letting that sink in. "How much is in it?" He named a figure that stopped me cold. More than I ever expected. Enough to secure me for years, no matter what. "She also left instructions," Radcliffe continued. "She told me that if circumstances shifted, her exact words, and you felt pressured or shut out, I was to explain the trust to you fully." I thought of Christmas Day, the Courier, the empty table, the photograph online. "Well," I said quietly, "I suppose circumstances have shifted." Radcliffe nodded. "I'll get the access paperwork ready. In the meantime, consider carefully how you want to handle things with your family." I gave a humorless laugh. That's the million-dollar question. When I left Radcliffe's office, the winter air outside cut sharper than before. In my pocket, I carried not just the cabin key but a sense of certainty. Miriam had given me something no one could take away. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel cornered. I felt prepared. 3 days after meeting with Radcliffe, I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. It was mid-morning, a time when my driveway usually sat empty. Through the window above the sink, I caught sight of a silver SUV pulling in. My son's SUV. My hand tightened on the coffee pot. I set it down carefully, wiped my palms on a towel, and moved toward the front door. The knock came just as I reached for the knob, 3 quick raps, then silence. When I opened the door, Nathan stood there, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. A strained smile touched his face but never reached his eyes. "Hey, Dad." Behind him, in the passenger seat of the idling SUV, Tessa scrolled on her phone, not even glancing toward the house. "What brings you here?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He shifted uneasily. "Thought I'd stop by. We haven't talked since Christmas." I leaned against the doorframe. "We could have talked then if you'd been here." A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "Yeah, about that. Tessa's mom, well, it just made sense this year, too." I raised a hand. "No need to explain. I read the note." He cleared his throat. "Right. Well, I also wanted to check in, see how you're doing, and maybe talk about some things." "What kind of things?" "You know, Mom's stuff, the accounts. I was in the garage the other day looking for that old fishing rod and saw some boxes with paperwork. Thought maybe you could use a hand sorting through it." There it was, the real reason. I didn't answer at once. I just studied him the way you watch an opponent make their opening move in chess. "What made you think I needed help with that?" He hesitated, glanced back at the SUV. "Well, you've got a lot on your plate, and Tessa and I have been talking. Maybe we could help you manage things just to make sure it's all in order." "For who?" I asked quietly. "For you. For everyone, really." I stepped back and gestured for him to come inside. He walked past me into the living room, glancing around as though seeing it for the first time. "Still looks the same," he said. "Some things don't need changing," I replied. We sat, me in the recliner, him on the couch. A gulf stretched between us, the kind that exists even when only a few feet separate two people. "So," I said, "tell me more about this help you're offering." He shifted again, leaning forward on his knees. "We just think it might be good to consolidate, streamline, maybe move some accounts. We've been reading about how vulnerable older folks can be to mistakes or scams." I let the silence draw out, longer than was comfortable. "Older folks, huh?" He flushed. I didn't mean. No, I think you did. I leaned forward. Tell me something, Nathan. Did you know Tessa forged my name on a $15,000 check a couple of years ago? His head snapped up. What? Don't lie. I know it went to a contractor in Tennessee for one of her rental projects. His jaw tightened, and he looked away. That silence was answer enough. You weren't checking in on me? I said, my voice low. You were checking on what I have. Dad, it's not like that. For you, maybe it isn't. But from where I sit, it looks a lot like you're trying to take over before being invited. He ran a hand down his face. We just don't want things to get messy down the line. Messy for who? He had no answer. Out the window, Tessa still sat in the SUV, phone pressed to her ear, never once glancing toward the house. She's not coming in? I asked. Nathan shook his head. She thought it'd be better if I talked to you alone. She's probably worried you'll say too much. He frowned. You're overthinking this. I leaned back. No, I'm finally thinking clearly. The clock ticked softly on the wall between us. I don't need help managing anything, I said at last. Your mother made sure of that. His gaze sharpened. What does that mean? It means I have everything I need, and I plan on keeping it that way. For a moment, I thought he might push, but then his shoulders sagged. We just want to make sure you're okay. I am, I said firmly, more certain than I had felt in years. He rose, smoothing the front of his jacket. All right, I'll see you soon then. I followed him to the door. Tell Tessa I said hello. He nodded, stepped off the porch, and returned to the SUV. Tessa leaned toward him, saying something as he slid into the driver's seat. The engine revved, and they backed out without looking back at the house. I stood on the porch watching the taillights fade. Then I closed the door. The house was quiet again, but not the hollow quiet of Christmas Day. This was a silence filled with clarity. Clarity about what they wanted, and how far I was willing to go to protect what Miriam had entrusted to me. I walked into the study, opened the desk drawer, and looked at the cabin key resting there. Just seeing it steadied me. Radcliffe's words echoed. Think about how you want to handle things with your family. I already knew, carefully and on my terms. I spent the rest of the afternoon combing through Miriam's files again, this time with sharper eyes. In one folder I found a list of contacts. Some were familiar, others not. Next to Frank's name, she had written trustworthy. Beside Radcliffe's, confidential. And next to a name I didn't recognize, Ivy Carver, Miriam had written only, in case of trouble. I made a note to ask Frank about her. That evening, as I sat in the recliner with the fire crackling low, I realized the truth. Nathan and Tessa weren't finished. This visit was just a test, a first probe to see if I would let them in, let them shift things under the pretense of helping. They would be back, and when they returned, I would be ready. It was the first Thursday in January when I noticed the black sedan. Not parked, not moving, just idling at the curb near my mailbox. At first, I assumed it was a delivery mix-up. But the longer it sat there, the more it felt like it was waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for someone. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, pretending not to look directly at it. A man in a dark coat sat in the driver's seat, head bent like he was reading something. The tinted windows gave the whole thing an intentional, staged look. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At last, he pulled away without even glancing at the house. I didn't like it. By noon, I had my jacket on and was walking the short half-block to Frank's hardware store. For 30 years, Frank had been Miriam's first stop for every project. And for the past 5 months, he had been mine. Frank knew people. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. Arthur, he said from behind the counter. Didn't expect to see you today. Yeah, well, I replied, leaning against the counter. I saw something this morning I didn't like. Thought maybe you'd know if anyone's been asking about me. His brow furrowed. What kind of something? Black sedan, I said. Sat out front for a while. The guy inside never got out, never knocked, just waited. Frank frowned. Not a plate I recognize. But I'll tell you this, Nathan was in here 2 days ago. I kept my expression steady. What for? He said you might need help clearing out some old junk. Wanted to know if I had a trailer for hauling. Claimed you'd probably be downsizing soon. Downsizing. That was the word you used when someone was being cleared out. You tell him anything? I asked. Frank shook his head. Told him if you needed me, you'd call yourself. Good. I let out a breath. Frank, you remember that name in Miriam's papers? Ivy Carver? He nodded slowly. Yeah. You thinking of calling her? I'm thinking I need to know why Miriam wrote, "in case of trouble," beside her name. Frank ducked beneath the counter, pulled out an old Rolodex, and thumbed through it until he found the card. Sliding it over, he said, "She's here in town. Runs a private consulting outfit, estate issues, dispute resolution. Not cheap, but she's sharp. The kind who knows what people are worth before they've even said a word." I slipped the card into my pocket. Thanks, Frank. As I turned to go, he added, Arthur, if Nathan's making moves, he's not doing it alone. Watch your back. I intend to, I said. That afternoon, I dialed the number. A woman's clipped, businesslike voice answered, Carver Consulting. Is this Ivy Carver? My name is Arthur Harrington. You don't know me, but you knew my wife, Miriam. There was a pause. Then, yes, I knew Miriam. She was very clear about the kind of man you are. I wasn't sure if that was meant as praise. She kept your name in her papers. Next to it, she wrote, "In case of trouble." Well, I think trouble's at my door. We arranged to meet the next morning at a small cafe on Main Street. When I arrived, she was already there, seated in a corner booth with a leather notebook and a cup of tea. She looked to be in her 50s, sharp-eyed, the kind who noticed everything but spoke only when it mattered. Arthur, she said, rising to shake my hand. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Saturday, you said trouble's knocking. She began. Tell me about it. So I did. I told her about Christmas, the couriered note, the visit from Nathan, the forged check I had uncovered months earlier, and the black sedan idling outside my house. She listened silently, jotting down notes from time to time. When I finished, she said, Your son and his wife are setting the stage. First, they undermine you socially by planting doubt about your independence. Then they move to financial access, accounts, property, and the appearance that you can't manage them. That sedan could have been a private investigator, could have been a buyer. Either way, it ties back to them. People don't idle outside for no reason. I leaned closer. Miriam trusted you, so I'll ask straight, what would you do? She flipped a page. Protect your perimeter. Lock down your assets. And build a paper trail that proves every choice from here forward is yours, clearly and deliberately. We spoke for an hour, going through deeds, account signatories, even the cabin Miriam had left in my name. At one point, she asked, Has anyone besides Nathan or Tessa been in the house since Miriam passed? I thought, only once. A man claiming to be from the utility company said he needed to check the meter inside. I let him in, but he never went near the meter. Her pen stilled. And you didn't call the company to confirm? No. She shook her head. That's a breach. From now on, no one enters without ID and an appointment you've confirmed yourself. When we left the cafe, she handed me her card. Arthur, I work for clients, not families. That means I'll do what's needed, even if it ruffles feathers. That's exactly what I need, I told her. On the walk back to my truck, I noticed a black sedan parked a few spaces down. Not the same one from my street, but close enough to make my skin prickle. I didn't mention it to Ivy. Not yet. Back home, I followed her advice immediately. I changed the locks, moved important files from the desk into a lockbox in the attic, and called the bank to update my alerts so I'd be notified of any unusual activity. That evening, while combing through Miriam's folders again, I came across something I had missed before. A sealed envelope with my name in her handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single page. If you're reading this, it means you've seen what I saw coming. Trust Ivy. And don't be afraid to let them believe they're winning until the moment you show them they're not. I sat for a long while, the fire in the hearth sinking to embers, thinking about how clearly Miriam had known both me and them. Somewhere outside, an engine idled faintly before fading into the distance. Trouble wasn't just knocking anymore. It was circling. And now I had my first true ally. It began with a knock, not the polite three-tap kind, but sharp and official. When I opened the door, a man in a beige windbreaker stood there, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Harrington?" "Yes. I'm here to deliver a notice from the county court. You'll want to read it carefully." He handed me a thick envelope and left without waiting for a signature. Inside was a petition for guardianship, filed by Nathan Harrington and Tessa Harrington. I read the lines once, then again, and again. They claimed I was no longer capable of managing my personal or financial affairs due to cognitive decline. They had even listed examples: unpaid utility bills, forgotten banking passwords, and one alleged incident of leaving the stove on. Half of what they claimed was outright lies. The rest were half-truths stretched so far they snapped. I called Ivy immediately. She answered on the second ring. After I read her the first paragraph, she said, "They've moved faster than I expected. Guardianship petitions are dangerous. Courts approve them more often than people realize, especially if they believe someone is isolated." "I'm not isolated," I told her. "No," she said, "but they're painting a picture where you are. And unless we get ahead of it, that picture becomes reality in the court's eyes." By noon, I was sitting across from her at her office desk, the petition spread open between us. "They even listed the cabin," I said, tapping the final page, "arguing it's at risk of neglect if left under my control." Ivy jotted a quick note in her book. "This isn't just about your independence. They're aiming for the assets tied to the cabin. They probably want it as collateral for something else." She stood, crossed the room to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder. "This is what we do," she said firmly. "We build our paper trail, medical clearance proving you're competent, records showing you personally handle your accounts, and witnesses who can testify to your decision-making." I frowned. Witnesses? Yes, people who can say they've seen you read contracts, make purchases, manage property on your own. Every detail counts. If we present a stack of evidence thicker than theirs, we win before the hearing even begins. She paused. "And if we lose?" Her eyes met mine. "Then you lose control of everything. But we're not going to lose." The first stop was the bank. The manager, Mrs. Dominguez, had known Miriam and me for years. She greeted me with her usual warmth. "Arthur, what can I do for you?" "I need copies of my last 6 months of statements," I said, "and any record showing I've personally handled transactions." She glanced at Ivy, then back at me. "Is there trouble?" "Family trouble," I said simply. "I need proof that I'm still steering the ship." She nodded. "You've been in here every month, making your own deposits. I'll print the records." From the bank, we drove to Dr. Patel's office. He had been Miriam's doctor and mine as well. He ran me through a quick exam, reflexes, memory recall, a short writing test. When it was done, he leaned back. "Arthur, you're as sharp as I've ever seen you. I'll draft a letter certifying full cognitive capacity." "That's exactly what I need," I told him. On the drive back, Ivy said, "Now we need witnesses outside your family. Neighbors, shopkeepers, anyone who has seen you handle business recently." I thought a moment. Nora at the hardware store. Imran at the grocery. I've been managing everything myself since Miriam passed. "Perfect," she said. "The broader the range, the harder it is for them to claim bias." We stopped at the grocery first. Imran came out from behind the counter, wiping his hands. "Arthur, how's the house?" "Well enough," I said. "But I need a favor," I explained, and his expression hardened. "They're trying to take control of your life? That's not right. I'll write whatever you need. You're here every week with a list, checking prices, catching mistakes. You're sharper than half my customers." I smiled. "Thank you, Imran." By day's end, we had 6 months of bank records, a doctor's letter certifying competence, and 3 witness statements from people I'd done business with. Ivy stacked the papers neatly. "This is a start. Now we file a formal response and attach all of this as exhibits. When's the hearing? I asked. 2 weeks. But they'll have our response in 5 days. That's when they'll realize you're not rolling over. That night, I sat by the fire, Miriam's sealed letter still in the lockbox upstairs. Her words echoed. Don't be afraid to let them think they're winning until you show them they're not. I wondered if Nathan and Tessa believed the petition was their masterstroke. Maybe it was, but masterstrokes can cut both ways. 3 days later, Frank called. Arthur, just so you know, Nathan came in again. Bought a lockbox. Said he needed to keep important papers safe before a big change in the family. What kind of change? I asked. Frank hesitated. He said, and I quote, once Dad's affairs are settled, things will move fast. I hung up and called Ivy. They're not just preparing to win, I told her. They're preparing to move the second they think they've got it. Good, she said evenly. Let them think that. It'll make what's coming sting twice as hard. 2 days before our deadline, I walked into the clerk's office beside Ivy and handed over a sealed envelope nearly as thick as the one I'd been served. The clerk stamped it, filed it, and returned a copy. When we stepped outside into the cold January air, Ivy's eyes flicked across the street. There it was again, the black sedan. This time, the window slid down. Nathan sat in the passenger seat. He looked directly at me, smiled as if victory were already his, and tapped the side of his head. I smiled back at him because in that moment, I carried a certainty he didn't. The paper trail was already working against him. 2 days after we filed our response, I was pruning the roses in the front yard when I saw the familiar black sedan slow to a stop. The door slammed harder than necessary, and Nathan stepped out. He didn't so much as glance at the flowers, Miriam's flowers, just strode up the path with quick, tight strides that told me he had been rehearsing this scene in his mind. Dad, he said, his voice clipped. Nathan, I replied. The January air between us was sharp, colder than the season itself. He held up a thick envelope, my court response. You think this is going to work? I set my pruning shears on the porch rail. I don't know, I said evenly, but it's the truth, and that's all it needs to be. He stepped closer. His cologne was sharp, too sharp for a man who was supposed to be grieving. You've made this harder than it had to be. Tessa and I could have handled everything. You wouldn't have to worry about bills, repairs. I'm not worried about bills. I cut in, keeping my voice calm but firm. I'm worried about being erased from my own life. For a moment his eyes flickered. Then his jaw tightened again. You don't know what you're up against. I tilted my head. Maybe I do. Maybe that's why I've prepared for it. He didn't like that. His eyes held mine for a long beat before he turned, walking back to the car without another word. That afternoon, Ivy called. They've read it, she said without preamble. And they're rattled. How do you know? A clerk friend told me Nathan came in this morning, asking about expediting the hearing. He's trying to push the date up. That means he's worried about what else you might have. The corner of my mouth lifted. He should be. 3 days later, Frank from the hardware store dropped by. Arthur, I probably shouldn't say this, but Tessa was here yesterday. Bought a new lock for a storage unit. She was on the phone, and I overheard something about getting the cabin papers before you move them. My brow furrowed. Storage unit? Frank nodded. Over on Ridgeway, the drive-up kind. I called Ivy immediately. She's moving something, I told her. Or planning to. That's fine, Ivy replied smoothly. Because whatever she thinks she's moving, it won't help them. What do you mean? Remember the trust Miriam insisted on for the cabin? Yes. Well, last month, I had you sign an amendment transferring the deed into the trust's protective clause. It's no longer your asset. It's a separate entity. Even if they won guardianship, they couldn't touch it without starting a completely new case. I let out a long breath. So, they're chasing smoke. Exactly. And the more energy they pour into it, the less they'll see what's really happening. That night, I sat in my chair and let my mind drift to the cabin. Miriam and I had bought it the summer after Nathan was born. Back then, it was just 2 rooms and a porch, perched on a ridge that caught the evening sun and made the valley glow. Miriam loved it so much she'd hum the same tune every time we drove the winding road up to it. Over the years, we added a new roof, a wood stove, a wraparound deck. Months before she passed, she had told me, "Promise me you'll never let it end up in the wrong hands." I had promised, and I meant it. A few evenings later, I took a walk to clear my head. Passing the corner cafe, I saw Tessa inside, leaning close to a man I didn't recognize. She slid a folder across the table. He glanced at it, nodded once. I didn't pause or stare. I just kept walking. But the image clung to me all the way home. Tessa passing that folder like a baton in a relay race. 2 days later, the hearing notice arrived, rescheduled for the following Tuesday, less than a week away. I brought it straight to Ivy. "This is good," she said. "It forces them to show their hand sooner. We'll have them reacting instead of controlling the pace." She leaned forward. "Arthur, I need you to be ready for one more thing. If they think they're losing, they may try something in public, an incident that makes you look unstable before the hearing." I frowned. "Like what?" "Could be anything. A sudden accusation. A scene in front of witnesses. Don't give them the chance." The next day, I attended the monthly veterans breakfast at the community center. I had skipped it for months, but I wanted people to see me sharp, steady, engaged. And it worked. I shook hands, swapped stories, even helped sort raffle tickets. Old friends like Cal and Ruben laughed with me over burnt coffee, and newcomers listened politely as I described the gardening project we'd started. Every handshake was more than just courtesy. It was proof to the room that I was part of this community, not some recluse fading away. On my way out, I ran into Nora from the hardware store. "Heard there's some family drama," she said gently. "If you need someone to vouch for you, you know I've got your back," Nora said. I thanked her. Another piece on the board. That night, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, Tessa's voice came through, sweet, but brittle. "Arthur, I just wanted to say, whatever happens in court, we hope you'll understand. It's for your good." I let silence stretch. "Funny thing about my good, Tessa. Usually I get to decide what that is." Her tone sharpened. "We'll see what the judge thinks." She hung up. For a while, I just sat there, the fire low and shadows shifting across the walls. Upstairs, Miriam's letter remained in the lockbox. The cabin trust papers were secure in Ivy's safe. And the rest, the part Nathan and Tessa didn't know about, was still in motion. While they chased the cabin, I was arranging the house, the accounts, even the car into the same protective structure. By the time the hearing arrived, there wouldn't be a single asset in my name worth seizing. That was the part they'd never see until it was too late. The Saturday before the hearing, I parked half a block from Nathan's house. Engine off, watching the soft winter lights spill across their porch. I wasn't there to spy in the ordinary sense. I just wanted to see how they carried themselves when no one else was looking. Through the bare branches, I saw Tessa carrying boxes to the SUV. Her phone pressed to her shoulder as she talked quickly, nodding at someone on the other end. A moment later, Nathan stepped out holding what looked like a briefcase. He handed it to her, and the two spoke in quick, clipped bursts before going back inside. From a distance, it looked like a mundane scene. But I'd learned that ordinary moments often held the sharpest intentions. I stayed long enough to watch them drive off toward Ridgeway, the same storage facility Frank had mentioned. My fingers tapped the steering wheel, not with nerves, but with the slow-burning certainty that they were still convinced the cabin was their ticket. I let them go. Instead of following, I drove home, put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. The fire crackled in the living room. On the page, I listed every person who had seen me in the past 2 weeks, at the cafe, the hardware store, the veterans' breakfast, along with dates and times. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Ivy had been clear. If they tried to paint me as unstable, I'd need credible witnesses to say otherwise. Dates, times, interactions, ordinary proof of an ordinary life. Each name I wrote down was another brick in the wall I was building. 2 days later, my phone rang again. Nora's voice. Arthur, you're not going to believe this, but Tessa was in here today with a clipboard. She was asking if anyone had noticed you acting confused lately. I kept my tone light. And what did you tell her? That you're sharper than most folks half your age. Arthur, she's fishing for trouble. I know, I said. Let her fish. She's casting in the wrong pond. That night I couldn't sleep. I stepped out onto the porch, the air cutting at my lungs, and looked over the dark yard. Miriam had always said, winter is when the truth shows itself. Trees stripped bare, no leaves to hide behind. Standing there, I felt the truth as plainly as the frost beneath my boots. Nathan and Tessa weren't protecting me. They were protecting themselves. And somewhere along the way, they had convinced themselves those two goals were the same. Monday morning, Ivy called. They filed an emergency addendum, she said. They're claiming you've been making reckless financial decisions. They listed the sale of the old pickup and your donation to the Veterans Fund. I almost laughed. I sold the pickup because I can't drive two vehicles at once. And I donated to the fund because I believe in it. I know, Ivy said, but they're spinning it as impulsive behavior. We'll counter with proof it was all deliberate. You still have the bill of sale for the truck? In the file cabinet, second drawer. Good. Bring it tomorrow. That afternoon, while sorting through the cabinet, I came across something I hadn't looked at in months. A photograph of Miriam and me on the cabin deck, taken the summer before Nathan's wedding. Her hair was caught in the wind, her smile easy. Nathan had been there too, standing off to the side, already half lost in his phone. Even then, I had sensed he was drifting into Tessa's orbit. She had a way of pulling people in, convincing them her approval was the most valuable currency they could have. Tuesday evening, as I was locking up, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Nathan stood there, hands shoved into his coat pockets. Dad, he began. We're hosting a little get-together tomorrow night. Friends, neighbors. Tessa thought you might want to come. I studied him. Tomorrow night? That's the night before the hearing. He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Exactly. A chance to clear the air, show everyone we're all on the same page. It wasn't hospitality. It was optics, and I could see it as clearly as frost on the window. If I showed up and said the wrong thing, they'd twist it into proof. If I stayed away, they'd claim I was isolating myself. I'll think about it, I told Nathan. That night I called Ivy. Don't go, she said immediately. They're staging it. A friendly gathering the night before a hearing isn't friendly. So I stayed away. Instead, I made sure I was seen at the Veterans Center, helping unload donated coats, chatting with people who'd remember where I was. The evening of their gathering, I drove past Nathan Street on my way home from the store. Cars lined the block. Through the front window, Tessa in a bright red dress laughed with neighbors while Nathan poured drinks. Every so often, someone's eyes flicked toward the door, as though waiting for me. I kept driving. The next morning, Frank caught me outside the post office. Arthur, you missed quite the night, he said. Tessa told folks you've been having memory slips. Nathan looked uncomfortable, but he didn't stop her. I thanked him, though my chest tightened. It was one thing to suspect they'd smear me. It was another to hear how casually they'd already done it. That night, I went through the folder again. Every receipt, notarized document, and witness statement was there. Between the pages sat the cabin trust papers, a quiet reminder that not everything they wanted was within reach. Before bed, I slipped a folded note into my jacket pocket. It wasn't for the court. It was for me, for words Miriam would have been proud of. I wanted to carry them like armor. When I turned out the light, the silence of the house felt different. Not heavy this time, but like the pause before the tide turns. Tomorrow the lines would be drawn. And this time I wasn't stepping into their game. I was bringing my own board, my own rules. They wouldn't see the last move until it was already made. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee. Sunlight cut through tall windows, striping the polished benches. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Ivy, hands folded, eyes on the wood grain. Across the aisle, Nathan and Tessa whispered with their attorney. a slick-haired man in a navy suit who looked like he belonged in a financial services ad. Tessa's red nails tapped out an impatient rhythm on the armrest. Nathan tugged at his tie, glancing at me, then away again. The bailiff called the court to order. A judge in her 60s, steady-eyed and unflinching, took the bench. She scanned the docket, then looked directly at the attorneys. "Let's proceed." Nathan's attorney spoke first, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "Your Honor, my clients are deeply concerned for the well-being of Mr. Harrington. They've observed patterns of erratic behavior, selling valuable assets, making large donations without consulting family, and most concerning, transferring property under questionable circumstances. They fear he can no longer manage his affairs and request guardianship to ensure his safety and preserve his estate." He sat down like he'd just delivered a flawless closing argument. Tessa patted his arm approvingly. Ivy rose slowly, her notes in hand. "Your Honor, my client has been the target of a deliberate attempt to strip him of his independence. The so-called patterns are nothing more than responsible decisions made by a capable adult. We will show that these claims are unfounded, and that the true motive is control, specifically over a lakeside cabin that has been in his family for decades." The judge nodded. "Proceed." We began with documents. The sale of the pickup, backed by a notarized bill of sale, including a signed statement from the buyer confirming it had been arranged weeks earlier. Then the Veterans Fund donation, complete with correspondence proving it was part of a planned annual contribution, something Miriam and I had done for years. Tessa shifted in her seat as each page slid across the bench. Nathan's jaw tightened. Then came witnesses. Nora from the hardware store testified about multiple recent conversations with me, each clear and coherent. Cal from the Veterans Breakfast described me organizing coat donations, handling sign-in sheets, even ribbing him about his handwriting. Each account was another brick in the wall Ivy had promised to build. Midway through, Nathan's attorney tried to strike. "Mr. Harrington, isn't it true you recently misplaced important documents and had to call your son for help?" I met his gaze. "I misplaced a utility bill. Found it 10 minutes later under the newspaper. If that's grounds for incompetence, Your Honor, then half the state should be under guardianship." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Even the judge's mouth twitched. But the real shift came when Ivy called Frank to the stand. Broad-shouldered in a pressed flannel, he swore in and sat tall. "Mr. Ivy, Ivy began. "You mentioned witnessing a conversation at the storage facility involving the plaintiffs. Can you share that with the court?" Frank nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I was there dropping off some tools. I overheard Tessa telling Nathan that once they had the papers signed, they could list the cabin and split the money before spring," Frank said. And I quote, "He'll thank us later when he's somewhere safe." The air in the courtroom shifted. Tessa's head snapped toward Nathan, his face flushing red. Their attorney leapt to his feet, objecting, but the judge overruled. "Mr. Ivy, the judge asked, "you're certain of what you heard?" "Clear as day," Frank answered. Didn't sound like concern for his well-being. Sounded like a plan to sell. From that moment, the tide turned. Ivy laid out the trust documents, proving the cabin was protected from any sale without my direct consent. She pointed out how every supposed concern had appeared only after Tessa discovered the cabin wasn't theirs to inherit. When my turn came, I kept my words simple. "I'm 72 years old. I've worked my whole life, served my country, and paid my bills. I'm not perfect, but I am capable of making my own decisions. My wife and I built that cabin for family, not as a bargaining chip. If my son and daughter-in-law can't accept that, it's their choice. But they don't get to take mine." The judge sat in silence for a long moment before delivering her decision. "Mr. Harrington, based on the evidence and testimony presented, I find no grounds to grant this petition for guardianship. Furthermore, I am issuing a protective order preventing the plaintiffs from interfering with your property or financial matters." She added, "The court strongly advises both parties to consider counseling, though that is outside my jurisdiction." The gavel fell with a finality that felt like a lock snapping shut. Nathan's shoulders sagged. Tessa whispered something sharp into his ear, but he didn't meet her eyes. Their attorney already looked past us, gathering papers like he had moved on to his next case. Beside me, Ivy turned with a faint smile. It's over. Walking out of that courthouse, the winter sun felt warmer than it had in months. Cold air filled my lungs, crisp and clean. Ahead of us, Nathan and Tessa walked quickly, heads close together, never once looking back. Frank clapped my shoulder. You held your ground, Arthur. Miriam would be proud. I nodded, unable to trust my throat with words. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea. The legal victory mattered, yes, but more than that, it was the truth I carried now. I hadn't been erased. My voice still carried weight. On the counter, a photograph of Miriam caught the lamplight. I imagined her smile. Not triumphant, but steady, calm, like the surface of the lake on a windless morning. I didn't celebrate with champagne or a fine dinner. I simply went to bed knowing that when I woke, my life was still mine. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, I rose before sunrise. Old habits are hard to break. For a moment, I lay still, listening. No vibrating phone, no knock at the door. Just the hum of the furnace and the steady tick of the clock. I brewed coffee the way Miriam always had. One heaping spoon of grounds, a pinch of cinnamon, a slow pour of hot water. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and grounding. I carried the mug to the back porch, the cold air stinging my face, and watched the first light stretch over the lake. It looked different now. Not because the water had changed, but because I had. The weight of the last months, the fear of losing not just the cabin but my say in my own life, was gone. Not forgotten, but gone. The day ahead was full of small plans. Help Frank with the roof repair at the Veterans Center. Check if Nora still had cedar planks on sale at the hardware store. Little things. But little things were mine again. Around 9, the phone rang. I knew the number, but didn't answer. Minutes later, the voicemail came through. Nathan's voice, clipped and careful. Dad, we need to talk. Tessa and we made mistakes. Call me. I set the phone on the counter. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't call back either. Not yet. I'd spent too long reacting to their moves. Now, everything would happen on my terms. Later that morning, I drove to the cabin. Snow crunched under the tires as I turned down the narrow road. The place stood waiting, pine branches heavy with white. The porch was still swept from my last visit. When I unlocked the door, the creak of the hinges felt like a greeting. Inside, the air was cold, but the sight warmed me. The quilt Miriam had sewn folded on the couch. The photo of us breaking ground decades ago. Me in work boots, her in a sun hat, hanging by the mantel. I built a fire the old way, stacking kindling just so. The flames caught quickly, snapping and throwing out ribbons of heat. I sank into the chair, letting the warmth spread through my bones. At noon, Frank showed up with a thermos of chili and 2 beers. Figured you'd be here, he said, stomping snow from his boots. Thought we might christen your freedom. We ate at the kitchen table, steam curling up from our bowls. Frank talked about the roof project, a new guy at the Veterans Center, and the rumor that Nora might finally retire. Ordinary conversation, and it felt good. When he left, I walked down to the dock. The lake was half frozen, ice catching the pale sun. I thought about winters past, when Miriam and I would skate until our toes went numb, then warm up by the fire. She always said this place had a heartbeat. Maybe she was right. Maybe that pulse was what had kept me fighting. A few days later, a letter came in the mail. Not from Nathan, but from Tessa. 3 handwritten pages. She wrote about her childhood, about watching her parents fight over property, about craving security for herself and Nathan. She admitted she'd handled things poorly, though never offered a real apology. She asked if we could find a way forward. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer with the winter firewood receipts. Some things could wait. While they had been focused on my assets, I had been focused on my life. The week after the hearing, I met with Ivy again. Papers were spread across her desk. You're all squared away, Arthur, she said. The trust is airtight. No one touches the cabin without your say. Good, I replied. But I want to take it further. Her eyebrow lifted. How so? I want to ensure that after I'm gone, the cabin becomes a retreat for veterans and their families. No sale, no private ownership. It stays what it has always been, a place for people to feel whole. Her smile was slow, but genuine. That can be done. And so, I spent January and February not worrying about what might be taken from me, but working to build something that would outlast us all. By March, I hosted the first weekend retreat. 10 veterans came, some with spouses, a few with children. We cooked over the fire pit, swapped stories, tinkered with the old snowmobile. One evening, a young father told me it was the first time in years his family had felt like they belonged somewhere. I didn't say much, just nodded. But inside, something eased even more. Spring arrived, and with it came an unexpected knock at the cabin door. Nathan stood there alone, hands in his jacket pockets. "Dad," he said softly, "I heard about what you're doing here with the vets. I think it's good." We stood in silence for a moment, the air heavy but not sharp. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he added. "Just to say I'm sorry. It wasn't enough to erase what had been done, but it was a beginning." After he left, I walked down to the dock once more. The ice on the lake was breaking into glittering shards. I thought about Miriam, about the Christmas morning when it all began, about the envelope that had once felt like an ending. Now I understood. It had been a beginning. The revenge had been quiet, legal, complete. But the true victory was this. Sitting on my dock, in my own life, knowing every step that had led me here was my choice. The water lapped gently at the shore. Somewhere a loon called. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. That was my ending. And my beginning. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the playlist now showing on your screen.